Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Global Recast, a series of curated conversations with distinguished and first-rate global leaders. As always, the goal is to examine grit, courage, and optimism in a fractured world. In the context of the inner workings of global leadership, from global policy icons and business leaders to diplomats and entrepreneurs, what can we learn from their anecdotes, unique stories, setbacks, triumphs, and everything in between? It's about the practice and scholarship behind courageous leadership and how these actions drive collective action. Today, we are looking at a topic that is somewhat unusual. Call it a pseudo-academic topic, and you would be right. The title of today's show is Making Sense of Cipolla in the Current Global Political Economy. I was having a casual conversation recently with my guest on today's show, and he passively mentioned the work of Italian economic historian Carlo Cipolla, The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity, which unfortunately, as it turned out, I hadn't read as of the time we had that conversation. And I was joking with him that I rely more on neoclassical economic tools for my research and not so much on economic history because I put more weight on predictive analytics. But today we see many forces at play in the current global environment, from the nexus between historical legacies, technological innovations, competition for strategic resources, geopolitical rivalries, and shifting patterns of production, exchange, and consumption. Not to mention, too, that the global system is currently in a deplorable state, and human affairs generally. And some will tell you that there is nothing surprising about this, because from time immemorial, human affairs have been in a deplorable state. For context, and for the benefit of our listeners, Carlo Cipolla was an Italian economic historian whose 1976 essay titled The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity, we're examining today. The essay has 5 basic laws, which are somewhat funny, but quite structured in terms of their ability to analyze systematic human misjudgment, rather than treat it as isolated foolishness. And in the context of the volatile and highly dysfunctional global environment, especially since 2020, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, I really like to analyze some of the trends, symptoms, and unintended consequences that we are seeing in geopolitics, in deglobalization, big tech, protectionism, and other inward-looking tendencies. Understanding this complex interplay is really very important for global leaders, especially based on their lived experiences. So we have a lot to unpack today. And to help us make sense of these issues, my guest on today's show is a respected business and policy leader with an impressive track record, in global political economy matters. He's Professor Patrick Utomi, our CEO, Center for Values in Leadership in Lagos, Nigeria. I'll read a quick bio. His bio is very long, but I'll keep it short. Dr. Utomi is a recognized Nigerian political economist and management expert. He's a senior fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants of Nigeria and a former presidential candidate. He has served at the highest levels in public offices, in the private sector, as well as in academia, including as a professor at the Lagos Business School. So, Prof, thanks for joining the Global Recast. And on a lighter note, look where the casual discussion on Cipolla has landed us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's get started. I would like to start with the first law, which states that always and inevitably everyone underestimates the number of stupid individuals in circulation. And as I process that, it appears to me that Cipolla is saying that we underestimate how widespread stupidity is, regardless of social class, education, wealth, or other denominators. People are consistently wired to think that there are fewer stupid individuals than there actually are. And this is funny, yet profound, because as we think about this in contemporary times, pretty much all serious leadership positions will put a lot of weight on intelligence, academic achievement, experience, social status, or what have you, in screening people for serious leadership positions. Those are your default criteria, if you will. But to think that we are saying that these things, in a way, have got nothing to do with the reality that some leaders may act stupidly. I mean, that is, it's scary to say the least. Status, achievements, and credentials don't ensure or protect against it. I'm interested in your thoughts. What do you say?
Yeah, no. It is so true. Let's take some of the major human experiences in, if you will, recent history. Let's take the Jews and Germany. 6 million human beings are exterminated. For what? By one of the more educated peoples in human history, Germans. It's interesting that one of the great philosophers of the public sphere is actually German, Jürgen Habermas. And it would really be a slap on the face of everything that he says about modernity and democracy, which is about rational public conversation. And yet the most eventful thing in German history of the last 100 years is how not rational the choices that cost the world so much were in Germany. The rise of Hitler, and how very intelligent Germans have followed in one of the most stupid, if you will, cases of choice in human history. How does that happen? I think in some ways you will begin to understand Cipolla in the context of the reaction of the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was so clear about German stupidity that Hitler executed him. But one of the very profound things that he said is, look, stupidity is such that you can't argue with it. Because stupid people give up already on thinking. Doesn't matter how many degrees they have, PhDs, but they don't rigorously analyze things to give accent and follow. And so this failure to rigorously, rationally engage issues, the point that Habermas, stands on as democracy, really, the marketplace of ideas, is so evident in what happened in World War II. And so Bonhoeffer says, you cannot argue with the stupid. Doesn't make any sense because they won't think. So Again, it's a waste of time. He says that there's a moral dimension to the whole matter. And that moral dimension is to recognize that there is evil. And it's easy to argue with evil because evil knows that it is evil and can try to rationalize itself. But stupid doesn't know that it is stupid. So you cannot argue with stupid, but you can argue with evil. Many times evil gets the stupid going, but evil remains rational in a manner of speaking, but stupid doesn't get rational. So that's one clear, unambiguous case of how lots of people can be stupid and not assume or even recognize that they are stupid. Now, if you move from the era of, say, the whole German experience and come to more recent economic history, you ask yourself, why did people take positions they took on, say, globalization? Is it rational? Is it not rational? I particularly enjoy reading the different plays on globalization from two professors at the same institute, Columbia's Earth Institute, with globalization and its discontent coming from Joe Stiglitz and his colleague, Jagdish Bhagwati, writing in defense of globalization. Yes, you can have rational views about where we're going, but most push and push back on globalization is not completely rational. You can argue that the efficiencies of comparative advantage, which is the ultimate justification for globalization, are self-evident. But you look at how globalization put down the global south, for example, in many cases, where the rational thing, given the wage differences in, say, manufacturing in North America versus somewhere in the global south. So a lot of manufacturing should have gone to the global south. So of course, the Asians did pick up quite a bit on that, but not enough rationally in terms of just looking at wages and the like. And we can talk in some more detail about all of that, but you can see that emotions kick in a lot more than rational reasoning in those things, which has led to a more thorough analysis or effort at thorough analysis of the evolution of the right, the new right in Europe, in the United States. As a center at Harvard that's led by Joshua Green, the Center for Moral Cognition, which tries to draw from neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology to explain these movements. Joshua Green's book, Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them, is a very interesting look at that phenomenon. Why are people taking the kinds of positions that they are taking in the base of some politicians who are to the right in the United States, for example? So I think that there is plenty of evidence that we underestimate the number of people who act without thinking or thinking deeply. So I believe Cipolla is quite correct in saying that we very often underestimate how stupid people have dominated history.
No, this is quite profound. Thanks for the deep dive. And it's funny, you know, a lot of what you unpack there, part of the second question, part of the second law, the probability of a person being stupid, the law says, is independent of any other characteristic of that person. So I'm not going to ask you to unpack law 2, but I will just speak a little bit more to it and from there pivot to law 3, because a lot of what you unpacked in the first law are sort of part of law 2. And this is very scary. The second law is scary to think that the probability that someone that is stupid is independent of any other characteristic, sort of challenges logic. This is scary because we're essentially saying there's no reliable way to predict stupidity, based on appearances or credentials. In a way, I mean, this reinforces the first law, since we naturally expect stupidity to be correlated with other negative traits, So we may end up ignoring or underestimating the distribution of stupidity across all groups. And when you rely on filters like academic qualifications, intelligence, or even professional expertise or income, I mean, those things become relatively important. But let me probe you further on the third law. And I'll state the third law now. It says, a stupid person is a person who causes losses to another person or to a group of persons while himself deriving no gain and even possibly incurring losses. And before I give you the microphone, this one is a little bit very funny. It's counterintuitive. And let's face it, this challenges any economist to the core, because at its core, neoclassical economics is basically about incentives, cost, and benefit. Those are all key drivers of decision making. But how do you rationalize this in the context of the four-quadrant model? And many people say the third law is the most dangerous, especially in the context of our global system. Cipolla warned that societies decline, not because of having more stupid people, but because non-stupid people underestimate the destructive power of stupid people. What do you make of the third law? I am really, really interested in your perspective, practice, lived experience, and other anecdotes based on your work.
The power of emotion to draw people into a perspective can block their capacity to rationally examine issues. I mean, I already gave one clear example, the case of the Jews in Germany. Most of the Germans who were cheering on as Jews were being sent to concentration camps, what benefit directly to themselves could be derived from incinerating millions of other human beings? Absolutely none that I can think of directly. For most of these people, they have never come to a heart. And you look at ethnic conflicts around the world and the kinds of terrible things people do to other people just because there's an identity difference. You ask, what is the benefit that really comes to these people from damaging those people? Yet, as we saw with that bringing destruction to Germany, and as we see every day in places like Sudan, where they've managed to completely, literally destroy their country based on identity politics that's totally meaningless, you will find that the experiments that Joshua Green, for example, writes about on how emotion trumps reason are real. So many very well-educated people, for example, who could, thinking rationally, have realized, no, this is not the right thing to do. Just refuse to think rationally because it is easy. There's a famous quote from the from World War II Germany, from a Reverend Martin Niemöller. You know, it goes something like, first they came for the, I guess, communists. And I said, well, I'm not a communist, you know, so why should I even bother with that? Then they came for the Jews. And I said, those troublesome Jews. Then they came for the Catholics. And I said, thank God I'm a Protestant. And finally, they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. You know, and these kind of illustrates the fact that human beings can so narrowly define their self-interest that they don't realize that the loss of human solidarity invariably comes back to haunt themselves, because they could be up next, but they don't think that way. So first of all, they have either cheered or been inattentive when the other human beings were being killed or whatever, and not thinking that it could be their turn next. And people who have power, as the Nazis had, or most fascists do, get further and further emboldened. So at first it is this out group that they go after. Then as they get bolder, they go for groups that ordinarily didn't think they would become victims. But the non-thoughtful person just says, it's not me, it's that group, until it becomes them. So yes, that is a very correct thing. This fact that human stupidity often neglects to recognize consequences even to themselves ultimately.
Thank you. Quite a number of themes to unpack there, and you did a very nice job of, tying it back still to the first law, where you talk about the fact that evil remains rational. I mean, that's really very profound. And also taking it to the moral dimension, as well as your examples around globalization or deglobalization, as it were. And that most evils, are rational, and that takes me to the point about framing, I mean, a stupid act harms others without benefiting the actor. And we say in many cases, the actor is also worse off. We've seen stupidity, in this new emerging order masquerading as ideology or virtue. Some frame it as moral purity. Others justify it in terms of identity or dogma, like Riley alluded to here. And for me, in the context of this platform and initiative, the Global Recast, you find that our world is under so much pressure now. The global system is fractured, and even those in charge of age-long institutions that are meant to help, the rules-based international order, they seem powerless. And the greatest threat to global stability, it appears, is not even evil. It's not ignorance and not greed, but it is this systematic stupidity that is protected by power, by ideology, and by risks that is so grossly underestimated. And so I want to, again, take you to the fourth law, the fourth law of stupidity, according to Cipolla. This one says, Non-stupid people always underestimate the damaging power of stupid individuals.
Yeah.
Non-stupid people tend to underestimate how damaging the impact of stupid individuals can be. And in particular, I talked about non-stupid people constantly forgetting that at all times and under any circumstances, to deal and associate with stupid people infallibly turns out to be a costly mistake.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the nexus, the intricate tapestry of leaders having to work across aisles to collaborate and all of that, this then even complicates this. So for this law, I would like to hear your perspective at an institutional level. If you look at global institutions, especially modern institutions that are so structured in a way that they are operating at the mercy of stupid actors. And finally, and perhaps more dangerously, is the tendency to avoid accountability in order to prevent conflict. And I'm not going to mince words there. Look at Russia, Ukraine, that's a classic example of everybody knows the fact, everybody knows the aggressor,
Mm-hmm.
everybody can see what's happening. But how did we get to a point that it appears that leaders, players are trying to avoid accountability, all in the name of preventing conflict or stopping the war? So sum it up together. How do you explain all of this, again with our central model here,
Yeah.
Not a fun word, stupidity, but what do you say?
The truth is that power is a very interesting element to deal with. There are people who think that if you have power, the best thing to do is to pacify you so that you can have peace. And one of the best examples is Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, who was famous for going to pacify Hitler and saying, peace. At last, we got peace. But we all know that in doing that, you only encourage that person who's drunk with power. And you saw that in spite of Neville Chamberlain's appeasement, Hitler got more encouraged. We have a tendency also, and I tell you, I every year try to attend the WTO public forum. It takes place in September. And that of this year, an American academic was speaking and wondered why the world shouldn't isolate the United States because it was being disruptive of world trade. And that is an irrational position to take. But everybody, took a dive because of American power. How do you try to isolate the big elephant in the room? But it was a rational position to take. The road is to disrupt world trade. Keep them outside the room. Let everybody else trade with one another. But it doesn't add up when you look at power. And so people tend to then react to power in that way and suboptimize on outcome. So this happens repeatedly in the way that the world functions. Let me give an example of the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress, I spent the last year as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And, if anything fascinated me about the year in Washington, it was watching how dysfunctional the U.S. Congress really is. And for some reason, the political play takes the actors away from the fact that the ultimate goal is to make laws that's in the best interest of all of the people of the United States. But the nature of play, and the power games can take you away from a rational outcome. And this happens a lot in terms of how we live together, in terms of the nature of global trade, in terms of what we do with supply chains. And look at what has happened since COVID made people realize how dependent on China everybody was on global supply chains.
Mm.
So what's a rational way of reducing that dependence, for example? Nothing really rational has been an outcome. What has come is a further power play in terms of thinking supply chains. Let's become more protectionist. Let's produce things that we're not capable of producing efficiently in the United States, because the consolidation of American power requires an American industrial disposition of more of those things being done at home than abroad, forgetting completely that it was rational choice that moved American private sector actors to begin to source from China. The famous conversation between President Barack Obama and Steve Jobs, is a case in point. When Barack Obama asked Steve Jobs why the iPhone was being made majorly in China, and Steve Jobs gave very simple story of how they wanted to meet certain deadlines, and they were going all over America trying to find good software engineers, and turned out that one local government in China could produce all the software engineers they were running around the whole of the US looking for, and they would earn a very small fraction of what the American software engineers will earn. That's the whole thing that Adam Smith's premise of comparative advantage was based on, and the very essence of international trade. But now we're standing international trade on its head because of power, but okay, let's understand this, there were different perspectives. Adam Smith was opposed in thinking by Frederick List, who was more a nationalist economist, and whose model is what the Asians used with industrial policy that enabled Asian economic ascendancy. So if you then look at it from ideological perspectives, maybe, but then you have Nobel Prize winning economists like Paul Krugman, who yesterday were very rational Adam Smith adherents, but today seem to be moving towards the Frederick List side of the. So these things, tell you a thing or two about human behavior.
No, thank you again. Thank you again. That helps to corroborate, what you said so far. And I like how you also brought the conversation on industrial policy to this. In Asia, we've all seen the miracle, happening in Southeast Asia. And the conversation about Paul Krugman, that's also very, very profound. Krugman, like, was a big fan of globalization and, how nothing could go wrong. But in fairness to him, he later, came out to say, hey, guys, I was wrong. I underestimated what technology could do. And he said he never foresaw that globalization would transition to become hyper globalization. And that was what rendered a lot of his modeling and those predictive tendencies, to becoming effective, as it were. But that being said, let me bring you to the fifth law so that we can, I know we are running out of time, so we can at least look at two other questions that are outside of Cipolla, as it were. The fifth law pretty much summarizes, all of the preceding four laws, and it says that a stupid person is the most dangerous type of person. And I think based on what you've said so far, that's incontrovertible. I mean, this is essentially saying that a stupid person is even more dangerous than a bandit. If you look at the four quadrants.
Yeah, the bandit is like the evil person, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Who
You
is
almost can argue with the bandit, but
the
the
most
stupid person you
notorious?
can't.
Yeah, the most notorious in the quadrant. But what Cipolla is saying here then is that based on the first law, stupidity is widespread. The second law says it is unrelated to status or intelligence or credentials. The third one talks about how stupidity causes losses to everyone, including the actor.
Themselves.
Yeah, and the fourth one says that the damage is systematically underestimated. But for the fifth law, if we bring it back to the conversation on global dysfunction and how even deterrence doesn't seem to have much power in this era. For many decades, global stability, relied largely on deterrence, whether you're talking about nuclear deterrence, economic sanctions, even reputational damage, But in this era, it's almost as though stupid actors, miscalculate, they discount future losses, and they sort of interpret punishment as some validation, or persecution, as it were. So the most dangerous failures are not intentional, It looks like they are mismanaged, and so I would like them to get your perspective. What's your take on this whole notion about the transition from efficiency-based globalization to the current model that is driven largely by power and risk? You already alluded to that, in your previous submission, but based on the Cipolla model, when you think about the current global system, which when you compare it to what we had before 1914, the so-called golden age of globalization, and in light of what you said so far about the five laws, how do you reconcile the golden age with the ongoing scrambling between US and China, the decoupling, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Germany going back to coal-fired power generation, and all of that? These anomalies don't seem to be consistent, with what science or assumptions on rationality could have predicted.
These things are cyclical. They go around, and then you get all this non-rational or irrational behavior. Then there's huge consequence. Then a new leadership emerges, and the world begins to correct itself until it gets to a point, a new set of not so rational actors move into this. And the cycle, globalization has gone through so many rounds. This is not the first round. Even the golden age wasn't the first round of globalization. It just happens that, because of colonial power, it was easy for the movement of goods, services, and people during that period between 1870 and 1914. And when things collapsed in 1929 and the World War II took place, began a new world order. And then as people began to prosper and all of that, those who want to protect the gains from that prosperity begin to get protectionist. The decision-making process becomes less rational, invariably, typically it leads to war, and the world begins afresh. I am hoping this particular new round of protectionism, power, non-rational, power-based choices does not lead to a war, because it has typically, if you look at history, in its cyclical nature, eventually it leads to war, and then after the war, people sober up, and the cycle begins again. What it requires is for the emergence of some leaders who think differently. How a Churchill, who was considered a leadership failure, then after Chamberlain emerges. In that same way, some things that will go wrong, people will find that, all this not so rational choice leads to some outcome that they don't really think makes enough sense. They may find a new leader in one of those countries that thinks differently, and leadership can then moderate culture, and culture moderates stupidity, because stupidity is ingrained in culture. But when a leader, and the most important thing that leaders do is set the tone of culture. If you then get the right leader that sets a new tone for culture, the world can begin to travel a different track again. And unfortunately, this cycle may then repeat itself. One of the amazing things that institutions that were erected as World War II came towards an end was to lengthen the cycle of this thing going around. Those institutions kept off a world that was more inclined towards becoming more and more humane, even though power still prevented. I mean, let's take the so-called global south and the poor countries and where they are in this whole arrangement. If you recall, the softening was moving towards what was the general discussion of the new international world economic order around the 1970s. They're thinking of more fairness. How do you get a more fair system? President Jimmy Carter was going to put his weight behind moving towards a new global. Then Ronald Reagan got elected, and the Cancun summit that was supposed to take place was poo-pooed, and then we went the way that we have gone. Maybe the experience coming from these current dysfunctions that describe global order will eventually push up one leader that thinks differently, and the institutions become more strengthened, and then we'll get new ways for a while.
Yeah, so I totally agree. Essentially, you're saying that global supply chains are being redesigned, not because market failed necessarily, but because history returned. And I also like your comment on leadership and culture, in your exact words. You said leadership moderates culture.
Yeah,
And culture,
culture. Sure,
yeah,
yes.
and culture, influences stupidity or what have you. And I think that aligns with the popular saying that by Peter Drucker, I think, that culture eats strategy, for breakfast. Um, um, that then takes me to you. Let's pivot now to you as a leader, in global political economy. Navigating uncertainty is part and parcel of leadership, whether at the local, regional, national, or global level at that. And we know that oftentimes global dynamics that ignore local realities end up failing big time. So as a scholar and practitioner in business, in leadership, political economy, you must have had your fair share of ups and downs, the triumphs, the setbacks. that define leadership, especially in this era of global disruption and uncertainty. So I'm interested in any experiences or anecdotes that you'd like to share from your close to 5 decades in the trenches, any major setbacks that, help you to bounce back, any particular examples or experiences that you'd like audience, to hear. This is the time to give you the microphone to share those.
Okay, well, in 1998, I published a book titled Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies. And so I have been face to face with uncertainty and have thought of all kinds of ways to navigate around them. And one of the things that I have done from this awareness of how uncertainty disrupts economic planning and growth has been that through the Center for Values in Leadership, which I founded 20-something years ago, I've had an annual conference in which I try to bring strands of academic thinking with policy leadership, and with practice, if you want to put it that way, implementation. And the idea is to use this tripartite approach. And by the way, I'm a huge a fan of the outcome of a conference that took place in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985, sponsored by the Aga Khan Foundation, on a tripartite approach to development where the private sector, the public sector, and what was called private development agencies back in those days, the NGO community, work collaboratively, each doing what it does better than the other best to advance the cause of development. So I thought that a tripartite approach to development was so important that I instituted this annual lecture series to work on these matters. And the great puzzle that I've had is that with all the ideas put on the table, somehow policy still manages to go a different direction and poverty persists. Because the central, essence of my being, if you will, is how do you reduce poverty? How do you build up the dignity of the human person? Because the greatest violator of the dignity of man is poverty, as far as I know. And you will see people agree with you and go out there as policymakers and do a completely different thing. The shock, has never left me. And on many occasions I said, okay, let me go in there and be the policymaker. And then you discover Socrates. What did Socrates say many years ago about democracy? He said democracy, he was very suspicious of democracy. It was such that criminals will want to share in government and democracy will allow them. The truth is that ultimately, democracy is such that we end up with a kakistocracy ruled by the very worst. If society doesn't have certain institutional pillars, where in many developing countries in Africa today, electoral process is dysfunctional, what you get is not the kinds of people who should make kind of policies that would lead to. And I like to use one particular example. It is clear that one of the biggest challenges to development is what the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto essentially calls the mystery of capital. The poor have assets, lots of assets, but their assets are not fungible. They don't become capital. Essentially because there are no representational systems, as he calls them. The land registry, which can allow a person take that piece of land the grandfather left in the middle of nowhere and leverages it to get a loan to develop a business. So the mystery of capital remains the problem of financing private sector-led economic development. Hernando de Soto has been invited to some places I know many times to speak on this matter. And yet, the institutional pivots for representational systems that will enable poor countries to overcome the mystery of capital have not been effectively engaged. You ask yourself why, and you find that the art of governing sometimes diverges from its objective as very, very narrow-minded leaderships focus on state capture and those kinds of elements that entrench personal power over the kinds of choices that enable growth and development take place. Again, I can give an example. I recently visited the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, an extraordinary $20 billion investment by a Nigerian entrepreneur. You would think that everybody would be cheering that level of commitment. And what you get, Nigerian public officials are the ones throwing spanners in the works every day because it is a rent pipeline, the old license Raj, like India would call it, from which they were, extracting tolls. And here, this entrepreneur has come to solve the problem. And instead of thinking of the national benefit, they're thinking this is going to get in the way of our gravy train. So these are things that I have been forced to deal with as the truth of where we must go. And I find that the truth is not really what governs. There are many other goal displacements that influence the direction that countries travel more than, unfortunately, what can lead to strong economic growth.
Thank you, Doc. And it's interesting. I was going to make that the last question, but your comment about Dangote and the saboteurs, as it were, in the public sector who are trying to frustrate its efforts. That's consistent even with the first phase of our discussion on stupidity, on Cipolla again, because everybody can allude to what used to be before the Dangote refinery. I don't live in Nigeria currently, but I know that for many decades, the 4 or so refineries that they had, they were not functioning. Gradually, people are beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel, that for me, in many ways, would sort of corroborate what has already been said about, on why mass stupidity with coordination can become even more destructive than cancer, as it were. And in many ways, again, this sort of amplifies the 5th law, which says the greatest threats to civilization are not enemies, but they are uncontained stupidity at scale, and I don't want to go there, but that also speaks to the rot in the public sector and how your take on development and, helping people at the lowest rung of the ladder, would then mean that there's going to be a lot of work on the tripartite model that you talked about. In my work, we've seen different strands. We call it the triple helix model, or some call it the quadruple model, where you bring government, the private sector, academia, and civil society together to, again, find common grounds. Some scholars even have sort of scaled it. I think you have to the 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th order, bringing media, culture, and what have you. Before I let you go, for current and aspiring leaders in international public policy, who will watch this interview at some point, how important is grit and courage in leadership? What do you think they need to know? Those who are aspiring to at some point, uh, take their craft to the global level in international public policy, aspiring leaders, graduate students, doctoral scholars, for someone like you who has, done a lot in this space, in 2 or 3 sentences, what do you think are those important things that they should strive for?
Well, back when I was in grad school in the 1970s, there was Jeffrey Pressman at UC Berkeley, who wrote this book on implementation. And one of the points that never left me from Pressman is that the real object of public policy is the change of human behavior. I mean, you tie a road not because asphalt makes for smooth travel, but because people need to change how they go from point A to B, and asphalt will therefore provide a smooth place on which they run. But many times I see people think of policy without getting into how to change human behavior. They assume that once they make a policy choice, the goal is achieved. But all policy must begin, in my thinking, with human behavior and how you change it. I mean, our whole conversation this evening has been about how people can behave out of what makes sense. So if you assume that they will behave in a particular way in policy choice, you make a huge mistake. We've been talking about culture and change and all of that. It's interesting that Jared Diamond out of Colombia, and some of the really most bright thinking about how societies have failed through human history, comes back to values. In the book Collapse, Jared Diamond basically makes the point that societies have failed through human history as a result of culture, the values. So policymakers have to be more sensitive to issues of culture, the values that shape that human behavior that needs to change for the goal to be achieved. Secondly, back in the 30s, Herbert Simon talked about satisficing, that you cannot expect to optimize on choice, really, because you're dealing with human institutions in many ways. I think that one of the things that econometricians have done to choice is that they've gone too rational, and and people have forgotten that, and somebody I like the way that he deals with, or he dealt with this back in those days. He's was the Austrian, British, American that wrote they wrote to serfdom, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Anyway, just flown out of my head his name, but he makes the point too about this. The real final point I would like to make is that the community of practice must, I think, of necessity, look at inclusion in a newly defined way of not just everybody being in the house pissing out, rather than some people being outside the house pissing into the house. But in a way that it essentially takes the best of people in and yet incorporates the community of clients, in the sense that, you go back to Thomas Kingsley and how this whole business of affirmative action came along, which people are rebelling against today because it seems not to be equitable in terms of the talents being elevated over identity. Yes, you can include, you can be sensitive to identity without missing the point that we live in the age of an aristocracy of talent. If you go to Adrian Woolrich's navigation around that subject, you can have inclusion and have optimization of talent. It is now being used as an excuse to push back on inclusion. Those in a representative bureaucracy, going back to Thomas Kingsley, a bureaucracy that has people that it is servicing in it will be a more effective bureaucracy than one that, in the name of aristocracy of talent, does not incorporate people from the client groups serviced by that bureaucracy.
No, thank you. And that brings us to the end, and before I wrap this up, I really again enjoyed your conclusion there, and it may interest you to also note that, part of the reason this show was launched in the first instance was I got frustrated with this whole obsession, with rationality and all of that. Of course, the neoclassical framework, it's littered with the whole idea of treating human beings as though they are machines. You try to make economics look like physics or some of the physical sciences, when in reality, that some of the most critical decisions that have major intergenerational implications on people's lives, on budget, on development, these are made by leaders who are not machines. I'm sorry. They're human beings. Some of these leaders cry, they love, they hate, they have emotions. So why does economics continue to pretend, that you can make optimal decisions, without taking cognizance of those cognitive limitations? Let's face it, there are cognitive limitations, and when you by the way, the economist you are talking about, I would suppose that should be Hayek, the guy who got
Hayek.
Who got the prize, I think in 1970 something. Is British in Austria, yeah. And I've read a lot of.
He came from Austria to Britain, eventually moved to the US.
To America,
I have a joke that they all start from Austria and end up in the US.
But
Schumpeter, whoever, all of them.
Yeah, but hey, like we said at the beginning, we said it was okay for this to be academic because the listeners are, wow, this was going to be academic, and I like that you really took your time to walk us through some very interesting anecdotes and history and all of that. So this concludes this edition of the show. I've been talking to Professor Pat Utomi, a renowned political economist who has done a lot across boardrooms in the policy sphere, and in the civic sector. He's the founder and CEO of the Center for Values in Leadership, based out of Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you so much, Prof, for taking the time. This has been a very, very enlightening session, and we're grateful to have your, caliber of thinker to really share your perspectives and anecdotes, from your close to 5 decades of experience. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
It's a great pleasure.